Welcome! Today I've journeyed south to explore the Eastern Geelong Cemetery, located in the coastal city of Geelong in Victoria. I'm here to find the final resting place of Eliza Callaghan, an Irish convict who was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1821. I was first drawn to Eliza's story after learning about her horrific and still unsolved death, and it left me wondering, who was this woman and what kind of life had she lived to meet such a tragic end? I had no idea what I was stepping into. As I began to research, I discovered while there had been some work done on her life, much of it was sparse or superficial. And then when I visited her memorial gravesite at Geelong Cemetery, I was shocked to find a QR code linking to a story about her, one that portrayed a version of Eliza I barely recognised after a month of in-depth research. It felt unjust and even careless to see her legacy framed in a way that overlooked the complexities of her life and the truth of her experiences. And then seeing the spirit of Tasmania on the bay, quite a sight, it just felt like a sign that it was time to tell Eliza's story as truthfully as the records allow, not through the myths and assumptions so often projected onto convict women. Elizabeth Mary Callaghan, or Eliza as she was known, lived through some of the key moments in Australia's early colonial history. From her time in Van Diemen's Land to her marriage to John Batman, the controversial founder of the city of Melbourne, she was part of a world that was changing fast. And even though she was close to people who shaped that history, her own story has often been pushed aside in favour of her husband's. Now this video is about giving Eliza her place in the story, not just as Batman's wife, but as a woman who faced the challenges of convict life with strength and resilience. Eliza was born in Ennis in County Clare, Ireland in 1802. And by 1820, she was working as a servant in London, when she, along with two men, a John Newnham and a John Madden, was charged with feloniously disposing of and putting away a forged and counterfeit banknote for £1, with intent to defraud the Bank of England. Eliza was sentenced to death. Fortunately, her sentence was commuted to 14 years transportation. The trial proceedings offer us a deeper insight into the circumstances surrounding her conviction. Witness Samuel Cordell testified, "I keep the Lord Hood Public House in Wych Street, Limestone, and on the 10th of June, sometime after 4 p.m, the female prisoner came in with a bottle and had some liquor, which came to 10 pence or 1 shilling. She gave me a £1 note and I gave her change. I kept the note in my hand and she immediately left. My brother-in-law Bird came in and said something, and I'd say that something was that the note was a bad one." So Samuel continues, "I then wrote Mrs. Murphy on it, as she appeared to be an Irish woman. Aren't all Irish folk Murphys? And on Saturday the 17th, the prisoner Newnham came in at about 4 p.m, and a number of people were there. And he asked for change. He gave a note to my wife, and I took it out of her hand, and she said to him, 'That is a bad note. You shan't have change. I shall keep the note, and you had better be gone.' My brother-in-law was in the passage. Newnham was stopped. So basically the trio had a small counterfeit scam running, possibly involving a few more individuals, but they were stopped by the Cordell family, which led to their trial and transportation. Eliza and her two accomplices were imprisoned at Newgate Prison, where she remained until May 1821, and her jail report simply stated bad. On Sunday the 20th, she was transferred to the transportation ship the Providence, which departed from Woolwich, the same vessel that carried convict Elizabeth Church, featured in my previous video about the Barfoot family. I love finding those convict connections. Now, although 17-year-old Eliza's convict records didn't include a full physical description, I was thrilled to discover it in the UK Prison Commission records. And even better, the records also contained descriptions of both of the Johns. Elizabeth was described as follows: 5'3", fresh complexion, brown hair, hazel eyes, slim build, and she was born in Clare Island and she was a spinster. Just a quick reminder, you can always pause the video if I haven't left a record or a headstone on long enough for you to read. Just hit pause, read it, and then continue on with the video. The Johnson Sunday Monitor, a London newspaper, reported the removal of the female convicts from Newgate Prison on the 20th of May. It said, yesterday morning at 5 o'clock, 39 female convicts were removed from Newgate by Mr. Brown, the keeper, assisted by Mr. Hardy and other officers of the prison, in hackney coaches to the landing stairs of the Thames Police Office, where they embarked on board a Gravesend vessel and were conveyed to the ship Providence, lying off Woolwich, bound for New South Wales. They are most of them young women and were in high spirits. The Providence departed Woolwich on the 13th of June 1821, carrying 103 female convicts. After stops at Port Praya and Rio de Janeiro, the ship arrived in Hobart Town on the 18th of December 1821, and 54 women disembarked there, including Eliza, while the remaining female convicts continued on to Port Jackson. I have to admit that the Eastern Geelong Cemetery truly surprised me, and I believe it's the second largest cemetery I've visited for the Convict Lives project, the Melbourne General being the largest. Now, I arrived without great expectations, but the history here is remarkable. Many convicts and their families are buried within these grounds, including numerous Vandemonians who came up from Tasmania to settle in Geelong or passed away passing through. So the older Church of England section is especially beautiful, with its distinctly old English charm, helped by the fact that the grass is still lush and green, if you can see there. So I don't know if they've got a great watering system or it's because it's closer to the ocean. You can actually see the ocean in the distance, and I think maybe that was why some of the graves, or a lot of the graves, had like a kind of a grey colour to them. Now I don't know, and if you do, please let me know in the comments, but the salty air, would that make headstones and graves sort of like a greyer, different colour? The graves had just a different colour than I was used to. Anyway, that was just one observation. But there are many stunning headstones and monuments in this cemetery, and among those laid to rest here are some significant figures. So if you're ever in the area, it's definitely worth stopping by to explore the rich history here. Eliza, along with 53 other women, was taken to the Hobart Town Jail to await assignment. Now, while researching Eliza's life, I came across a description of her in Cecil Philip Billett's 1979 book, John Batman, the story of John Batman and the founding of Melbourne. And I was struck by the way he chose to describe Eliza. He wrote, although only 17, she was already an experienced girl, passionate and sexually attractive in a dark, perhaps even sullen way. Yet I have found no historical evidence that supports this description. No physical accounts, no detailed records, no surviving images. So it raises an important question. Where did this author get his ideas about Eliza? What sources, if any, was he drawing from to create such a vivid and highly emotional characterization of a young convict woman whose real story remains largely undocumented? I suspect part of the answer lies in the dramatic way Eliza met her future husband, John Batman, and in the long history of convict women being romanticised, often overtly sexualised and frequently viewed as inherently immoral. These long-standing stereotypes have shaped the way many people have interpreted women like Eliza, regardless of what the evidence actually shows. On arrival, Eliza was assigned to a Mr. Petchy, most likely John Petchy, a former convict who had risen to be keeper of the Hobart Jail. And Billett writes, on her arrival in Van Diemen's Land, Eliza was apparently assigned to the keeper of the Hobart Jail. Well, she was. She was with him and his wife for nearly 3 years, during which time she absconded 3 times. Each time on recapture, she was jailed for varying periods and forced to submit to the agonising and humiliating punishment of the stocks, and on one occasion to the wearing of an iron collar. This is correct, but there is some important information missing. I can find only 2 recorded instances of Eliza absconding in her convict record. Her first recorded offence was in March 1822. She was charged with being drunk and disorderly. She was imprisoned at His Majesty's Jail in Hobart for 1 week, during which time she was required to wear an iron collar and sit in the stocks twice for 2 hours each time. It was an extremely harsh punishment for a first offence, and I can't help but wonder if her being assigned to the keeper of the jail played a part in this. The power he held over her would have been considerable. In 1822, female convicts were held in a small makeshift facility within the precinct of the Hobart Town Jail. This early version of a female factory was hastily constructed in 1821 in response to the growing number of women arriving in the colony. It was separated from the main jail by a brick wall, but shared the same cramped and poorly ventilated conditions. The facility was rudimentary and overcrowded, with limited space for work or exercise. Women were often exposed to the public and even to executions taking place in the adjacent jail yard. Despite being called a factory, it lacked the infrastructure for meaningful labour or rehabilitation. It served primarily as a holding place for unassigned or misbehaving female convicts until they could be placed in service or transferred elsewhere. This situation persisted until 1828, when the Cascades Female Factory was opened in South Hobart, offering a more structured, though still harsh, environment specifically designed for female prisoners. 3 months after her first offence, Eliza absconded from her master's house on the night of the 24th of June and remained absent all night. It would have been bitterly cold in Tassie at that time of year, so what prompted her to leave the house that night? As punishment, she was sentenced to sit in the stocks for 3 hours the following day. Eliza's final offence, or recorded offence, occurred in January 1823, when she was found absent from her master's premises for 1 day and 1 night, and this time her punishment was a week on bread and water, along with 2 hours each day in the stocks at His Majesty's Jail in Hobart. Historian Billett goes on to describe Eliza as a strong-willed and rebellious girl. But was she? We really don't know what was going on in the Petchy household to cause her to abscond twice. Eliza did in fact abscond a third time, however it was not from the Petchy household. According to Don Bradmore, who has written a biography about Eliza, which can be found on the Female Convicts Research website, the Petchys had left Van Diemen's Land on a short visit to England, and in their absence, she was assigned to the Superintendent of Police in Launceston, a Mr. P. A. Musgrove. And it is from this assignment in early 1825 that she absconds for the third time, and in Don Bradmore's words, vanished completely. Don Bradmore writes, on at least 13 occasions throughout that year, from late February until late November, the following notice appeared in the Hobart Town Gazette and Van Diemen's Land Advertiser. Elizabeth Callaghan, 5 feet 2.5 inches, brown hair and eyes, 19 years of age, a servant, tried at London September 1820, sentence 14 years, arrived per Providence, native place County Clare. Has absconded from the service of P. A. Mulgrave Esquire, a £2 reward. They couldn't find her. Eliza had been very successful with her runaway attempt, which suggests to me that maybe she was desperate. We really don't know what was going on in the Musgrove household. So this is Cecil Philip Billet's rather colourful take on what happened, and it's not factually accurate, and I sometimes think he missed his calling as a Mills and Boon writer, but maybe some of it is true, and here it is. He writes, after her last humiliation she could bear no more. One night she escaped again, determined this time never to be recaptured, and found her way out of the hated town into the clean, cooler air of the surrounding bush. Since leaving Ennis, Eliza had known nothing but the life of towns, stinking of humanity and its effluence, noisy, vicious, yet in its teeming activity, strangely companionable. She had been one of that breed of slum dwellers who could as easily go to ground in the maze of malodorous tenements, that means foul-smelling housing, hope I'm saying it right, that afflicted London as fight off with boot and claw the unwanted attentions of any unsavoury suitor. Now the deep, brooding silence of the Tasmanian bush must have filled her with awe and terror. Silence made so much more eerie by the sudden strange bird calls and the rustling movements of unseen things which screamed of hidden dangers. Eliza was ignorant, tough, and at this time could neither read nor write. And now loneliness, fear, the cruel strangeness of this country must have utterly overwhelmed the young girl. Bolters, meaning escaped convicts, and Aborigines and lecherous settlers would have added to her fears of the alien landscape. When she came upon Batman, not the superhero, but John Batman, at his rough camp in the bush, we can imagine her initial fear and distrust, slowly overcome by her exhaustion and the bluff good nature of the handsome bushman, to say nothing of his sexual attraction to her. In John she saw a man, tall, powerful of frame, yet gentle. I might have to start playing the theme song to The Bold and the Beautiful in English, but yeah. And welcoming. His features were well formed, and his mass of dark curly hair put her prison cut to shame. Did it? How does he know what her hair was like? Anyway. He was not yet a landowner, and it seems unlikely that any shelter he may have erected on his leased property would have been much better than the primitive huts previously described. But he took her back to whatever home he had, and, bearing in mind his ardent temperament and the dearth of women in the colony, he must have been very glad to do so. We can conjure up an imaginary meeting between the two young people in the mountain wilderness. Well, we sure know you can, Cecil. The scared yet defiant girl making her painful way through forests of hostile trees and the strange noises of alien birds and animals, and the eager young explorer who already knew this country so well, strong, vigorous and delighted to meet a prospective mate. Whether John Batman found Eliza wandering in the bush or whether she stumbled upon his property Kingston at the foothills of Ben Lomond remains unclear. What is known is that Eliza stayed at Kingston and adopted the name Eliza Thompson. She was soon pregnant with her first child, a daughter named Maria, born on the 5th of September 1825. In 1828, when John petitioned the governor for permission to marry Eliza, she was already the mother of 3 daughters by him, and by the time the couple had received permission to marry, they had 6 daughters: Maria, Lucy, Eliza Jr., Elizabeth Mary, Ellen, Adelaide, and Palon Armenia Frances Darling. There is no mention of her ever being captured again. When we look at Eliza's story, it's easy to see how a kind of romantic myth has grown around her. She was an escaped convict alone in the Tasmanian bush when she crossed paths with John Batman. And that single moment has fueled generations of storytelling. Writers have taken that encounter and turned it into something dramatic, something adventurous, something far more romantic than the evidence ever actually supports. But the truth is likely very different. Eliza wasn't a mysterious bush heroine or a temptress wandering around the wilderness. She was a young woman in an incredibly vulnerable position, recently transported, separated from everything familiar, and trying simply to survive in a harsh and unforgiving colony, especially for convict women. Yet because her meeting with Batman was so unusual, later writers felt free to embellish her story, painting her as this captivating runaway who somehow bewitched a pioneer. And here's the problem. We don't have a photograph of her. We don't have a detailed description. In fact, we know almost nothing concrete about her appearance, although there is a couple of photos of her daughters, and I know some have said they may have looked like her. But despite this, the romanticised version of Eliza, often written by men, sorry guys, has stuck. It's become the dominant narrative, overshadowing the real young woman behind the myth. An article I wouldn't really recommend for several reasons, not least of which is the provocative headline, Eliza Batman, the Irish convict, reinvented as Melbourne's founding mother was both colonised and coloniser on 2 violent frontiers. Now, frankly, I find it difficult to comprehend how anyone could label an Irish female convict as a coloniser. Eliza had no agency in her circumstances, nor in her transportation to Australia, nor in her ability as a married woman to return to Ireland permanently. So the article was published on the academics news site The Conversation. And I believe it was written by 2 professors, a Penny Edmonds and a Michelle Berry. And it does have some good information. It notes that in 1834, the Batmans named their 7th daughter Palon Armenia after an Aboriginal woman, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Palon Armenia was a Palawa woman from the Ben Lomond region of Tasmania. She was among the Aboriginal people relocated to the Flinders Island settlement during the 1830s, a time of profound disruption for her community. Her name appears in the journal of Quaker missionary George Washington Walker. Walker and James Backhouse were Quaker missionaries who undertook a journey through the Australian colonies to observe and report on the treatment of convicts and Aboriginal people. Deeply committed to social justice, they were particularly concerned about the exploitation of Aboriginal women by sealers and whalers operating in the Bass Strait Islands. These women were often subjected to violence, coercion, and forced relationships. Walker and Backhouse documented these abuses in their journals and advocated for the rescue and relocation of affected women to Flinders Island, where the government had established the Waibalena settlement. I hope I'm saying that correctly, Waibalena. And their work formed part of a broader Quaker tradition of bearing witness to injustice and promoting reform through peaceful means and moral persuasion. It's worth noting that the Edmonds and Berry article misidentifies the Commandant of Flinders Island's name. The Commandant of Flinders Island from 1832 to 1834 was William James Darling, not Francis Darling. And from what I've found so far, he seems to have had a really respectful and positive relationship with the Aboriginal people on the island. There's a particularly interesting article by Anna Johnston titled The Little Empire of Waibelena, Becoming Colonial in Australia, which you can read online. Anna writes, in early 1832, Ensign William James Darling, a young officer in the 63rd Regiment, was appointed Commandant of the Aboriginal settlement on Flinders Island. His selection marked a shift in approach, with the government hoping his military background would bring order to the troubled settlement. Despite his military role, Darling is remembered as a thoughtful and pragmatic figure. His official instructions encouraged peaceful engagement and the promotion of civilised habits through example. He reportedly built respectful relationships with Aboriginal people and criticised settlers who portrayed them as violent, acknowledging their resistance as a response to invasion. Though young and relatively inexperienced, Darling was seen by some as a steadying influence during a difficult period. He left Flinders Island in 1834 when his regiment was posted to India. The fact that Darling was held in such high regard by the Indigenous people on Flinders Island, and that Palanomenia was directly under his authority on the island, suggests there is much more to this story. Eliza lived in an area where there were likely very few women, especially those with whom she could form close bonds or share common experiences. This isolation may have shaped her interactions with the Aboriginal women around her, potentially deepening her empathy and sense of connection. Did Eliza feel compassion for the suffering of the Aboriginal women around her? Did she see them as companions in a world that had not only mistreated her, but was also devoid of female company? Perhaps she also respected the way Darling treated the Indigenous people on Flinders Island, and naming her daughter after him was a gesture of honour, an acknowledgement of his more humane approach in a time of widespread injustice. And remember too, that Eliza gave birth to 6 daughters. Were there midwives around? Who helped her give birth? Maybe Palanomenia was the local midwife, and she also assisted Eliza with the births of her daughters. I mean, we don't know. And unfortunately, and regrettably, we don't have the voices of Palanomenia or Eliza in the historical record. Without their words, we can only speculate about the nature of their relationship and the significance behind the naming of the child. It is possible that Eliza and Palanomenia shared a meaningful connection, perhaps through visits, shared experiences, or mutual acquaintances. The naming may have been an act of friendship, admiration, or remembrance. And at the same time, we must consider how Aboriginal names and identities were sometimes appropriated in ways that reflected settler values more than Indigenous perspectives. The absence of both women's viewpoints invites us to approach their story with care, curiosity, and a deep awareness of the silences that echo through the historical record. So, who was John Batman? Much has already been written about him, so I'll keep my account brief. My focus here is on Eliza. John was a grazier, explorer, and one of the most prominent figures in the founding of Melbourne. Born in Parramatta, New South Wales in 1801, he was the second son of William Batman, a convict cutler and grinder from Middlesex, and Mary Ann Mobbs, a free settler. Raised in modest circumstances, John received basic education and was apprenticed to a blacksmith in Sydney. His early life took a dramatic turn when his testimony led to his master's execution for burglary. after which he worked as a jack-of-all-trades farmer. In 1821, a young orphan girl named Elizabeth Richardson, residing at the Female Orphan School in Parramatta, became pregnant and named John Batman as the father of her child. At the time, Batman was just 20 years old and living in Parramatta. The Orphan Institution Committee, responsible for Elizabeth's welfare, recommended that Batman marry her to preserve her dignity and future prospects. However, Batman refused to marry Elizabeth. Instead, the committee demanded Batman pay £50 to cover the costs incurred by the institution for Elizabeth and her child. His father, William Batman, a devout Christian and former convict turned respectable businessman, intervened and negotiated the amount down to £25. Right? The scandal was a source of embarrassment for the Batman family, and just 3 days after the matter was settled, John Batman and his brother Henry left New South Wales for Van Diemen's Land on the 29th of November 1821. This incident is one of the lesser known aspects of Batman's early life and may have influenced his decision to leave Parramatta and seek a new beginning in Tasmania. I'm sure it did. So, John moved to Van Diemen's Land with his brother Henry. He quickly established himself as a capable farmer, securing government contracts and eventually acquiring a 600-acre land grant. Batman gained recognition for his role in capturing bushrangers, including the notorious Matthew Brady, and for his involvement in early attempts at conciliation with Tasmanian Aboriginal people. He advocated for humane treatment and believed Aboriginal people could be influenced by kindness, a rare stance among settlers at the time. However, the Colonial Frontier Massacres in Australia, 1788 to 1930 website, presents a starkly different view of John Batman. It records that he led a dawn raid on an Aboriginal camp in the Ben Lomond area in September 1829. The camp was home to between 60 and 70 men, women and children. In his report to Thomas Anstey, the police magistrate at Oatlands, Batman estimated that 15 Aboriginal people died from their wounds and that he executed 2 wounded prisoners. The incident was reported in the Colonial Times on the 18th of September 1829 on page 3. According to the Colonial Frontier Massacre Map, a research project by the University of Newcastle, this particular incident is not considered a reprisal killing. Their interpretation is that Batman and his men came upon a group of Aboriginal people and killed them without provocation. However, I also came across another account, a letter written by Batman himself, which offers his own explanation of the event. Now, this letter is especially relevant for this video because it also includes information about Eliza. And I want to be clear that I am not making any judgments about the massacre itself. Instead, I am presenting both perspectives to illustrate the environment Eliza was living in and the kinds of circumstances she was surrounded by during this period of her life and who her husband was. A letter from Batman gave some justification for the colonial terror and the need for armed parties and was written from Ben Lomond. He wrote, "I have just time to say that the natives last Thursday week murdered 2 men at Oyster Bay and the next day they beat a sawyer about to death. On Sunday after they murdered a soldier. On last Wednesday they attacked the house of Mr. Boltby when he was absent. And if it had not been for a soldier who happened to be there, they would have murdered Mrs. Boltby and all the children. On Friday last, they murdered 3 men at a hut belonging to Major Grey and left a 4th for dead." Now, Batman was the first to employ native women as spies and guides, and the story is told of 3 of them persuading 9 men to come to Kingston. Mrs. Batman and her daughters were greatly terrified at their appearance, her husband being absent. Word was immediately sent to Mr. Simeon Lord, a neighbour, who described their warlike appearance and curiosity. The Mirror mystified them, and one had a girl's cap on his greasy, I'm assuming that's head, and another a larger article of feminine wardrobe. Maybe he was wearing some underwear. Their hunger led Batman afterwards to record, "Their appetite is enormous, devouring everything they meet. They are particularly fond of half-roasted eggs of every description, geese, ducks, hens. It is all one. So much so that Mrs. Batman's poultry yard cut but a sorry figure after the company." So obviously Eliza and her servants have fed the men. Batman arrived home at sundown, greatly to the relief of the family. Eliza lived through the period known as the Black War, a time of violent conflict between British settlers and Aboriginal Tasmanians during the 1820s and early 1830s. As colonial expansion intensified, Aboriginal people resisted the loss of their land and resources, leading to clashes marked by raids, reprisals, and military campaigns. While both sides suffered casualties, the impact on Aboriginal communities was devastating. The conflict eventually led to the forced relocation of surviving Aboriginal people to Flinders Island. Now, this is a very brief mention of the history, and I have included it to just help us better understand who John Batman was and to reflect on what Eliza may have been experiencing in her life with him. In 1834, John Batman helped form the Port Phillip Association, a syndicate of Tasmanian settlers aiming to expand settlement into mainland Australia. In May 1835, he led an exhibition across Bass Strait and claimed to have signed a treaty with Aboriginal leaders around Port Phillip Bay. In exchange for goods and a promise of an annual tribute, he claimed ownership of nearly 250,000 hectares of land, including the future site of Melbourne. The treaty was later declared invalid by Governor Richard Burke. Britain was against private settlers making treaties with local Indigenous tribes because they wanted the land for themselves. However, Batman's actions laid the groundwork for permanent European settlement in the region. John returned to the area in 1836, bringing Eliza and their daughters with him. They settled at Batman's Hill on the Yarra River, where they developed around 20 acres with buildings, gardens and orchards. Eliza's eighth child and only son, John Charles, was born in November that year. Edmonds and Berry wrote in their article that the Batmans brought with them 30 servants, including convicts, 2 Indigenous boys from Tasmania named Rolpana, also known as Ben Lamond, and Lunamina, also known as Jack Allen, as well as Indigenous men from New South Wales, referred to as the Sydney natives. I believe young Rolpana was taken from his mother by Batman, who wanted to raise him following the Lomond massacre, a deeply disturbing act. Despite his early success, Batman's final years were marked by tragedy and decline. He contracted syphilis, which progressively disabled him. As his health deteriorated, he became physically incapacitated and increasingly reliant on attendants, especially the Aboriginal workers from Sydney. Eliza began a relationship with his clerk, William Willoughby, and eventually left Batman, sailing to England in early 1839. Realising she would not return to care for him, Batman revised his will, leaving Eliza only £5 and attempting to bar her legal claim to his estate. The question is, how did he contact syphilis? Was this part of the reason why Eliza left him? Batman died alone, although not quite. I believe he was attended to by his Indigenous workers in his cottage at Batman's Hill on the 6th of May 1839, aged just 38. After his death, his children were separated and sent to live with friends and relatives. His estate, burdened by debt and legal disputes, was contested for years. Batman's legacy is complex. While he is celebrated by some as a founder of Melbourne and a bold pioneer, a sculpture of him no longer stands in the Melbourne CBD. And the federal seat of Batman was changed in 2018 to Cooper in honour of William Cooper, a Yorta Yorta man and prominent Aboriginal activist. John's final years, marked by illness and financial ruin, stand in stark contrast to his earlier achievements. Landscape artist John Golver described him as a rogue, a thief, a cheat and a liar, a murderer of blacks and the vilest man I have ever known. Yet his vision, determination and leadership made him a central figure in the shaping of Victoria's colonial history. So what were Eliza's experiences through all of this? Edmonds and Berry were correct when they wrote, "Popular histories have excluded Eliza and her family almost completely from these stories of colonial Tasmania and Victoria. She has often been dismissed as a low-class, illiterate doxy and drunken convict. The scant accounts of her life tend to be stereotypical. In the dictionary entry on John Batman, she is framed largely as a woman of somewhat abandoned character. But Eliza's convict records tell a different story. She could read and write, and there's no evidence she was involved in prostitution or any other criminal activity beyond a single charge for being drunk and disorderly. It's worth noting that Eliza had once been cruelly described in official records as an illiterate doxy, a deeply derogatory term used at the time to imply she was both uneducated and of questionable morality. This label reflected the harsh and prejudiced attitudes towards convict women, rather than the reality of Eliza's character or conduct. In March 1828, Eliza married John Batman at St John's Church in Launceston, with Reverend James Norman officiating the ceremony. By then, Eliza was already a mother to 3 daughters, like I've said previously. Permission for the marriage had been granted by colonial administrator Sir George Arthur, and he noted that although Eliza had previously absconded, her last offence was in 1823. And it's believed that John's role in capturing the bushranger Matthew Brady earned him favour with the colonial authorities, which may explain why the couple's request was approved and Eliza's absconding was overlooked. In April 1833, Eliza was granted a free pardon. This marked a major shift in her status and freedom. Unlike a conditional pardon, which still imposed restrictions, a free pardon meant she was fully released from all legal consequences of her conviction. She was no longer considered a convict and could live, travel and work without oversight from colonial authorities. This legal forgiveness would have helped Eliza move more freely in society, especially as the wife of John Batman and mother to their growing family. While social stigma may have lingered, the pardon gave her a fresh start, one that few convict women were granted. A year later, Eliza was officially freed by servitude and received her certificate of freedom, a formal document confirming she had completed her sentence. This certificate reinforced her legal independence and marked the end of her obligations to the colonial penal system. Eliza was kept busy raising daughters at Kingston on the Buffalo Plains. Elizabeth Mary was born in 1829, followed by Alan in 1831, Adelaide in 1832, and Palonomenia in 1834. Edmonds and Berry also noted that Eliza played an active role in the upbringing of the two Aboriginal boys in the Batman's care. She taught Rolipana and Lunamina to read and write and to recite the Lord's Prayer. In 1830, she also had both boys baptised, along with 4 of her own daughters. Although the Batman's property at Ben Lomond covered over 7,000 acres, the land was too rugged to be highly productive. With the convict population growing and demand for meat increasing, Batman needed better grazing land. By 1827, most of the prime land in Van Diemen's Land had already been taken, so he began considering a move across Bass Strait to Port Phillip. He identified a site for a future settlement, which would later become Melbourne. Later that year, he sold his property Kingston for £10,000 and transported his livestock, equipment, building materials and staff to Port Phillip. He had left Van Diemen's Land for good. By 1836, John was ready for Eliza and his daughters to join him at their new weatherboard home on Batman's Hill, just north of the main settlement along the Yarra River. The property already featured a garden and the early stages of an orchard. The Batmans hired Miss Caroline Newcomb, a well-educated young woman who had migrated to Hobart in 1833 for health reasons, as a governess for the children. It is interesting to note that Caroline Newcomb has an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography about her life and existing photos, but Eliza does not. There were 30 servants employed to help with the household and daily chores. It was a far cry from Eliza's earlier life. What a transformation she had experienced. According to Batman's biographer, P.L. Brown, Batman grazed his treaty block north of the settlement, promoted racial harmony and gave temporary office space to the first police magistrate, William Lonsdale. He had a library, good sheep, exceptional horses, attractive cattle, a superior house in a splendid situation. Sadly, any ambitions the couple may have held for conquering Port Phillip were cut short by John's deteriorating health due to syphilis. When they arrived, his condition was already serious. By July of 1836, walking had become a struggle, and by year's end he was so frail that he had to be transported in a wicker handcart. Don Bradmore wrote, "When James Backhouse, the English naturalist and Quaker missionary, visited Melbourne in 1837, he noted that Batman had been much of an invalid since the time of his departure from Van Diemen's Land. By 1838, Caroline Newcomb had departed from her role as governess and a replacement was appointed, Nicola Ann Cook, a young widow from Tasmania. It was around this time that Eliza began a relationship with John's clerk, William Willoughby. Willoughby was also a transported convict who had received a 7-year sentence for larceny. When John learned of the situation, he threatened to remove Eliza and the children from his will. In what may have been an effort to ease tensions, Eliza chose to leave for a time, and in February 1839 sailed alone to England, leaving the children in John's care, although they were separated and placed with friends and relatives for care and support. There are no surviving records that tell us what Eliza did during her year back in England. Did she return to her old neighbourhoods? Did she travel to Ireland to visit family? And how must she have felt, returning as a relatively wealthy woman after having been banished as a convict all those years ago? Upon her return to the colony of Victoria, Eliza discovered that Batman, now facing financial ruin, had died on the 6th of May 1839, just 3 months after her departure. Shortly before his death, he had altered his will, leaving Eliza a token sum of £5. To recover outstanding debts, the government had also seized the family home at Batman's Hill. Eliza wrote to Queen Victoria seeking compensation in recognition of her husband's contributions to the development of the Port Phillip district, but her appeal was unsuccessful. Over the next few years, Eliza, with the support of William Willoughby, became embroiled in a lengthy and complex legal battle to contest Batman's will and claim what remained of his estate. However, most of the property had already been sold to settle debts, and the costs of the court proceedings quickly consumed what little remained. Eliza married William Willoughby, Batman's former storeman, in 1841. The marriage was short-lived and troubled, particularly after the death of Eliza's only son, John Charles. In 1845, Eliza eventually left Willoughby and moved to Geelong, likely to be closer to several of her daughters, who were living there at the time. She lived independently under the name Sarah Willoughby. In 1853, William Willoughby was charged with the rape of a servant girl, a case that drew public attention and controversy. Although he was found not guilty, the trial further damaged his reputation. Later accounts suggest that Willoughby formed a relationship with a Gundjemarra woman named Susanna, with whom he had children, and after his death of a stroke in Craigieburn in 1856, Susanna and her children were left destitute and returned to country, adopting the surname MacDonald. So, what happened to young John Charles? He tragically drowned while fishing in the Yarra River in 1845. He was just 9 years old. On Saturday afternoon, the 11th of January, a melancholy accident occurred at the falls at the Queen's Wharf, which terminated in the death by drowning of John Charles Batman, aged between 8 and 9 years, the only son and heir at law of the late Mr. Batman and defendant in the equity suit Batman v Lonsdale and others, which has been so long pending in the Supreme Court. It seems the child was with his sister playing at the falls, and not being willing to return home when she wished, she threatened to leave him and tell his mama of his disobedience. The little girl then ran from her brother a little distance, and on looking round to see whether he was following, she saw her brother, who had most probably stumbled in, attempting to run after his sister, struggling in the water, and being rapidly carried away by the current. Her screams brought several of the Aborigines to the spot, but before anything could be done for the assistance of the child, he sunk and was drowned. Strenuous exertions were made for the recovery of the body, but without effect that evening. Yesterday morning, at about 10:30, the body was found by one of the Aborigines near the south bank of the basin, about 12 yards below the falls. In 1903, an article titled "John Batman, Descendants of the Founder, Unpublished Memoranda" was published across several newspapers throughout Victoria. The exciting thing about this article is that it contains a letter written by Eliza to her daughter, Elizabeth Mary, who was staying with her uncle in Tasmania at the time. The letter, which was written in a house on the present site now occupied by the AMP Society, so remember this is 1903, so I'm unsure what the building is now, is here published in this article for the first time. And this is what Eliza wrote. Market Square, 30th of January 1845. My dear Elizabeth, I am sure you were much distressed when you heard of the death of your dear brother. I wrote a hurried letter to your aunt, acquainting her of the sad circumstances of the sad event, and also sent a newspaper with the particulars. It seems he was catching some small fishes which are left by the tide among the stones at the falls, and in getting up in haste, one of the stones gave way, and he was immediately carried away a considerable distance by the current into the middle of the unlucky Yarra Yarra, and before any assistance could be procured, my lovely boy had sunk. Every effort was made to get the body, but to no purpose, until next morning, when several of the blacks dived in different parts of the water and were successful in finding him. Oh, my dear child, had you but have seen him, you would have never forgotten his countenance. No person would have thought he was dead. He looked like he was in quiet sleep, with a heavenly smile on his sweet face. I am almost heartbroken when I think of him, and believe me, Elizabeth, all my happiness in this world is buried in the grave with him. I loved him to excess. The only thing that reconciles me to this bereavement is that I am sure he is now in heaven. The Lord has taken him from the evil to come. He saved him to me, and he has, in order of his divine will, taken him from me. And blessed be his holy name. I send you a piece of his hair which I cut off myself before he was put into the coffin. He was buried very respectably. Several gentlemen attended. They wore white bands and scarfs. He was carried in a hearse, and about 150 children followed, carrying flowers in their hands, which they strew over his grave. He was buried in the vault with his father, and placed on top of his coffin, which looked as fresh and as new as the first day it was placed there, although 6 years have elapsed since that unfortunate occurrence. Lucy has been living with Mrs. Solomon for some time, and intends to remain until they return from Van Diemen's Land. They go over in the next Shamrock. That's a ship that would go to and from Tassie and Victoria. The wax candles Lucy has now in her possession, they are very good. Give my affectionate love to my sister and Mr. Stevens, and accept the same, your affectionate and afflicted mother. What a lovely letter. I was surprised to discover that Eliza appeared to have a strong Christian faith. It's very interesting. The article also noted that the Mrs. Solomon referred to was the wife of an early colonial identity after whom Solomon's Ford near Footscray was named. The fort itself was named for one of the Solomon brothers, either Michael, Joseph or Judah, who were among the earliest Jewish settlers in Victoria. I wonder if Lucy had been living with the Solomons since her father passed away. Interesting. The article also includes some great information about what happened to the Batman's daughters. It asked, and what has happened to the Batman family? The pioneer's only son drowned at the early age of 9, so no one bears the name of Batman today. All that remains of the family, as far as can be judged, are 9 descendants. We are indebted to Mr. Austin Batman Weir, a grandson of Batman, for supplying us with a pedigree of the Batman family. Batman's family was composed of 7 daughters and 1 son. Maria, the eldest, married a Mr. Robert Fennell, who owned what was then known as the Yarra Grange estate. There is a tradition that some members of the Batman family buried an iron box containing considerable jewellery and money belonging to the family somewhere on the estate. And from what can be learned, the iron box is rusting somewhere beneath the surface of the soil now. Remember, this is 1903. It goes on. Elizabeth Mary, the favourite daughter of John Batman, was the second wife of the late William Weir, for many years a town clerk of Geelong. Lucy Batman was the beauty of the family. Mr. Weir has in his possession a photo of his aunt, taken when she was in the prime of her life, which, faded as it is, gives one still some idea of the personal charm of this lady who caused many young men's hearts to flutter in Melbourne's early days. Lucy gave her hand to a Mr. Lomas and eventually went to California, where she died. Palanomenia Batman was the wife of Dr. Daniel Bunce, at one time the curator of the Geelong Botanical Gardens, and who was the author of several well-known works. Mrs. Bunce died at the age of 25. The details about the other daughters are very meagre. Eliza Batman, named after her mother, married a Mr. William Collier, and Adelaide Batman married John Collier, his brother, and after he died she became Mrs. Bertram. Ellen Batman, the only unmarried daughter, died at the early age of 20. John Batman's biographer, P.L. Brown, wrote, "Without Batman, Eliza was lost, drifting." Far from drifting, Eliza appears to have remained close to her daughters and may have found work as a governess, a role that suggests both literacy and responsibility. Well, we know she's very literate from her letter. It is therefore quite confusing to try to understand what happened to Eliza in Geelong. In 1852, her daughter Elizabeth Mary referred to her as Elizabeth Callaghan, governess. Unfortunately, her inquest notes aren't available online, and I haven't yet had the chance to visit Prov in North Melbourne to read them. If anyone has the time and interest to look into the inquest records, please let us know what they reveal. Could there be more clues to Eliza's final years? On the 31st of March 1852, Eliza Batman, aged 50, was murdered in her home in Geelong, reportedly kicked to death by an unidentified man wearing iron-shod boots. Two individuals, Eliza Wilson and John Trigg, were initially arrested in connection with the crime. They were held for a time, and although a trial was recommended, they were ultimately released and no trial ever took place. The incident sparked considerable public outrage, particularly from the Argus's Geelong correspondent, who criticised the lack of resolution and justice in the case. From the Argus on the 1st of April 1852. I am called upon to record another atrocious murder committed on the person of a female of rather abandoned character, at least at present so reported, named Sarah Willoughby. I have not gone out to see the lady yet, as the inquest, which sits at 3 o'clock, will afford me an opportunity of doing so, but I am informed that it presents as horrible an appearance as ever human eyes beheld. At present it will perhaps be better for me not to acquaint you publicly with all the particulars obtained, but the following may be read on as correct, having obtained them through the Chief Constable. Information was given to the police at about 11:30 this afternoon that the unfortunate woman was found dead in her house at Ashby, and on going out there they were informed that a disturbance had taken place between the deceased, a woman named Eliza Wilson, and one or two men. This, coupled with other information, induced the police to apprehend the woman, Eliza Wilson, and a man named John Trigg. On searching the female prisoner at the watch house, a £1 note with fresh blood stains on it was found concealed under her armpit. I am glad to say that, as yet, appearances are favourable to the opinion that there will be little difficulty in tracing the dark deed home to the perpetrators of it. It has caused a great sensation, not only in the neighbourhood but all over the town suburbs, and it is not to be wondered at. For a while, the executive is taking and promising to increase the police force to the necessary strength and efficiency. The people are being murdered in their houses and in the streets like dogs. Up Latrobe and act like a man, or fly from the colony in disgrace. And that phrase is a public call for Charles Latrobe to take decisive action and show leadership in response to a serious issue, likely, of course, the unresolved murder of Eliza Batman. It warns that if he fails to act like a man, he should leave the colony in disgrace, reflecting the public's frustration and demand for justice. A couple of months later, another article appeared from our own correspondent, so this is the Geelong correspondent, on the 1st of July 1852. And he writes, "Perhaps you will recall that I previously forwarded a full report of the inquest into the death of Mrs. Willoughby, who was murdered at Ashby around the end of March. The report was not published in the Argus, likely due to a glut of news at the time. As a result, I now refer to the account published in the Geelong Advertiser on the 1st of April, which I know to be accurate. I hope you will allow me to summarise the key evidence and include the full testimony of the attending doctor. The discharge of the prisoners Trigg and Wilson may have been technically lawful, but I say perish the law that prevents full exposure of such atrocities. I like this journalist. The law officers of the Crown had a duty to the public, to the Crown, to themselves, and to the accused to bring these two individuals to trial. I ask the public to consider the state of society when such prisoners are released simply because 2 sessions have passed without trial and not one word of objection from the Crown lawyers. Mrs. Willoughby was found murdered in her own home on the morning of Wednesday, the 31st of March. Evidence from the inquest revealed days of heavy drinking and quarrelling in the house prior to her death. Witnesses including Thomas Millard and Alan Smith confirmed hearing violent arguments, and Millard swore to hearing heavy blows on the Sunday before her death. Sergeant Grant testified that Eliza Wilson was wearing the deceased's bonnet and shawl at the time of her arrest. Constable Blunt found a blood-stained £1 note hidden under Wilson's arm, despite her denial of having any money. Ellen Smith stated that Wilson, a regular customer, visited her shop on the morning of the murder after the death, but before it was publicly known, and made no mention of the incident. Sarah Charlton testified that she saw Trigg and Wilson at the house and asked if Mrs. Willoughby was hurt. Wilson replied, yes, rather so. When asked if she was dead, Wilson said, yes, she is dead. Charlton then saw the deceased lying on a stretcher. When she asked Trigg how the woman had died, he replied it was no business of hers. Frederick Green also visited the house and found the deceased and noted she had not been dead long. He returned shortly after and found the door locked and both Trigg and Wilson gone. He tracked them to Knox's public house and brought them back to unlock the door. On the way, Trigg remarked, "The man that committed the deed would never rest." Wilson added, "She did not see it done." Sarah Crouch confirmed that Trigg and Wilson had possession of the house key and unlocked the door for her. Dr. P. Callaghan testified that on Monday the 29th of March he was called by Trigg and another man to attend a woman with a broken arm. He found her lying on a pallet with facial injuries and a contused head wound. She was conscious and sober. Cullen treated her and returned the next day to find her breathing had worsened. He discovered fluid in her lungs, suspected to be blood, and multiple broken ribs and bruises across her body. By Tuesday evening, her condition had deteriorated further. At 1:30 a.m. on Wednesday, Trigg reported her death. The unnamed short man later claimed Trigg was responsible for the violence. The deceased confirmed it was not the short man who had hurt her. However, Wilson later stated in front of the deceased that it was the short man, whom the deceased called George, who had struck her with a heavy boot shod with iron. So all this evidence was gathered hastily between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. on the day the murder was discovered. Even so, I ask any reasonable person, was this not enough to present to a jury? As for why a trial was not held, the only explanation offered was that the prisoners had been held for 2 sessions without being tried. At the last session, all witnesses were present, so it wasn't due to their absence. I was told the trial was abandoned because George could not be found. No subpoenas were issued this time, but that was not the fault of the witnesses. There's another paragraph where the journalist goes on about the negligence of officials, etc., but for time I will continue. There is another disturbing detail not included in the coroner's evidence. The woman who washed Trigg's clothes reported that they were heavily stained with blood around the time of the murder, and I believe the Crown is aware of this. If it's true, how is it that ordinary citizens uncover such facts while government officers remain ignorant? The journalist also goes into 3 other cases that were never brought to trial, and he's wondering what on earth is going on in Geelong. And there were other articles written at the time expressing outrage over the injustice of Eliza's case. Yet despite the public pressure and the weight of evidence presented at the inquest, the case was never solved and no one has ever been put to trial. The mystery of how Eliza came to be so violently assaulted and ultimately killed remains just that, a mystery. But from reading through this, my personal opinion is maybe she was at home alone, and these bad people have gotten into her house and robbed her and ultimately killed her, maybe even kept her hostage for a couple of days while they drank and fought, and who knows, we don't know. The failure to bring her killers to justice stands as a stark reminder of the limitations and failings of colonial law enforcement and judicial process in mid-19th century Victoria. Eliza didn't live an easy life. From her conviction in London to her years in Van Diemen's Land, and later as the wife of John Batman, she faced more than her fair share of hardship. But she also showed remarkable strength. She raised 8 children, earned her freedom, and built a life in a colony that was still finding its feet. And here is the lovely memorial for Eliza and her daughter, Palanomenia, and I believe that was erected by Palanomenia's descendants. Eliza is buried in an unmarked grave, which I will show you later where I believe that is. So Eliza's story isn't just about surviving the convict system, it's about what came after. She cared for others and she stayed close to her daughters even after her marriage fell apart. Her letter after the death of her son John Charles shows a woman full of love, faith and heartbreak. It's one of the few times we hear her voice directly, or the only time, and it's clear she was far more than the labels history gave her. Eliza's final years in Geelong are a mystery, and her death brutal. The violence she suffered and the failure of the justice system to hold anyone accountable is a painful reminder of how vulnerable women like her were in colonial society. Despite public outrage and strong evidence, no one was ever tried for her murder. It's a tragic end to a life that deserved better. But Eliza's story doesn't have to end there. By telling it now, fully, honestly and with care, we give her back the dignity she was denied. I believe there is much more to learn about Eliza, but for now that is for someone else to research. We remember Eliza Callaghan, not for the violence that ended her life, but for the strength with which she lived it. Her story is not just a footnote, it is a vital thread in the fabric of Australia's history, and one that deserves to be told as part of our extraordinary convict history.